There are 3 grid tutorials: Basics, Data Manipulation, and Advanced. This is the first tutorial. Let's go over the basics of a grid. For this topic, 90% of what you need to know about grids is covered in basics. So if you're on a project coding some grids, most grids will only show the features that I'm describing here. So here's a grid. Grids show tabular data for a store. I'll explain what a store is in more detail in a moment. Let's look at the code for this. So the way this slide deck works, this is an actual complete application. So in these 39 lines of code, this Ext application is the starting point for running the app. This has a main view, which is this, and then everything down here is the configuration for that grid. So grids have a title, optionally, and a columns array, and then the columns describe each column in the grid. For every item, and I'll get into these details more later, but just as a little overview here, every item has a text property, which is the column header, and then data index is the value from the feed that we're displaying. In this case, we're formatting the value because it's a date field. Most of the others aren't doing that. And that's what it looks like. If you know Ext JS, you know what a store is, but let me review that a little bit if you're not familiar with it. A store is a collection of records. Here's what a data feed might look like. So this is the data feed that was used in that previous slide. So what a Ext JS store does is for every item in this array sent from the back end, each of these is turned into a record, and those records are used to populate the store. So you might ask, why use a store at all? Why not just use the array directly? And that's because the record data type adds some features. It does data conversion, it does validation, and other things. And stores also have features like sorting and filtering. The conversion of that data is transparent to you. When you set up your store, it just happens automatically. And if we go back to that example, here's the configuration of that store. Again, the details don't matter. So let's talk about columns. The 2 key properties for a column are data index and text. So text is the title of the column. Data index is the value from the data feed that we're displaying. And by default, it simply shows the string value of that data index. So in this case, we're seeing the person's name here, and we're seeing their date of birth. Now that looks a little funny, but that's to emphasize that all it does is show the string value by default. The date of birth is actually a data object, so this is the string value of a data object. Now there's a couple ways to convert this, and one of those is shown here. There's a property called formatter. So for any column, you can associate a formatter, which by default will run a method inside of this utility class called ext.util.format. So it has a variety of formatting routines in it, and the code here is calling one of those routines. If one of those canned formatting routines isn't what you need, you can code your own formatter. So in this example here, we're calling our own method. It's pretty rare that you would need to do that, but you can. So in this case, this is actually calling a method up here, and this is sort of a silly example, but what it's doing is it's taking the person's date of birth and it's turning it into their astrological sign. That's what we're seeing here. And then age, in this case, the data feed does not have the person's age, so we need to calculate that. So in that case, we're free to do our own calculation, and that's shown here. So this is a function we're providing that takes the date of birth and the date of death, does some arithmetic, and is showing that. Normally you don't need to do those kinds of custom calculations. Normally you use one of the built-in features, but I'm showing you that you can do it if you need to. So let me review. The 2 key properties of a data column are data index, that's the value from the feed that's being shown, and text is the column header. By default, it simply shows the string value of that value from the data feed, but you can provide your own formatter specification that makes a call to a built-in format routine. In the rare case that you need to code your own, you're free to do it. So this is just using our own method for that. And you can also code your own renderer. So if you have to do some other kind of calculation, you can provide a renderer too. You can also provide a template. It's a property called TPL. You notice here these cells are showing kind of complete sentences. The code for this, there's the TPL. This is a big sentence. Inside of the sentence, it's using curly brackets, for instance, right there. That's a value from the data feed. So when you're using a template, the template can reference any value from the record. Now there's some specialized column types that have their own built-in renderer. So if you have a Boolean value, a date value, etc. So they kind of built-in renderers for different data types. Here's an example of that. So in the code here, let's look at, for instance, plays harp. That's a Boolean value in the data feed. So what this says is, if the value is true, display this. If the value is false, display, in this case, an empty string. Here's a check column that just shows a checkbox for a Boolean value. There's the date column. In the case of a date column, there's a property called format. So that just does it's a formatting string for the date object. And then once again, there's a custom renderer there. There's also a row numberer column type. That's pretty easy to set up. You simply say row number, just like that. And there's some other configs too. So you're free to set the width. You can set the width to be proportional to other columns using flex. You can specify whether the column is sortable, etc. You can read the API docs if you want more information on those. How do we know when the user takes some action, clicks on a row or something like that? That's done through events. Here's what the code looks like for that. So on any Ext JS component, you can add this property called listeners, and you can listen to certain events. Those events are documented in the API docs. For grids, there's the select event, among others. What that means is when somebody selects an item in the grid, this function will be run. The function is passed the record the user was on, and then we're free to do anything we need. So if I run this and I tap on an item, you can see here we're seeing that feedback message there. There's also something called binding. Any Ext JS component can use this binding concept. So right here, we're saying, I'm going to bind this property whose name, obviously we just made up. So when the selection property of the grid changes, this property will be updated. And then we're using or displaying that property elsewhere. So for instance, there's a panel off to the right here. So let me show you what this looks like. That panel to the right is automatically being updated because it's also bound to that same property. So again, when I select it on the grid, it updates the property here. This is bound to the same property, so this wakes up and it's displaying that data using the template that's being defined right here. Grid menus are customizable. So let me run this example. So here's what columns normally look like. You can sort ascending, descending, etc. But we can customize that. So notice what these arrows look like. And here we've customized it to use chevrons instead. So the code for that looks like this. This is where we're customizing that menu. Again, it's pretty rare you would need to do that, but you have the power to if you need to. You can also customize individual columns. In the previous example, we were overriding all the menu configs for all columns. In this example, we're only doing it for one column. So if I run this, and if we look at a normal column, it looks like it did before. But if we look at our customized column, that's our customization there. How do we control what the user can select, whether it's rows or columns or a cell range? That's done with the selection model. So you can control rows, continuous or discontiguous, rows or columns, cells, range of cells, and the configuration looks like this. Here it's set up to show every possible, option. Normally you would just leave it to the default, but you can come in here and turn these off and on as needed. So you could say mode multi cells true, and then the user could select a rectangular range of cells. And you could do the same for rows or columns.